California is a garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi.
Money isn't the only problem. Our flawed legislative process is also to blame. Just in case this official diagram of the budget process doesn't make that all perfectly clear, Professor Kathy Lee from the Political Science Department at Humboldt State University breaks it down for us.
If you look at the way that we've structured government in California, you really have three levels. You've got the one that we see on the surface. You've got a legislature that passes laws, a governor that signs those laws and enforces them, and we're supposedly deciding those things on whoever has the most votes is able to get the policy that they want.
But in California, the majority doesn't rule. Any law or program that requires new or increased taxes has to be approved by 2/3 of the legislature, and that means a small minority can block the will of the majority and cause gridlock in Sacramento.
On top of that, we have a third layer in California that even if you get the legislature together, even if they do it and they pass it, the voters can rescind that. The voters can repeal laws that are passed by the legislature. The voters can bypass the legislature and write their own laws. And the only way that you can amend a law that's been passed through the initiative process is through another initiative. So we've given that power to the voters. The voters in California will vote to allocate certain portions of the general fund to a specific purpose. Proposition 98 mandating 40% of the general fund going to education is a good example of this. But we've also mandated money that should be spent for mental health. And we've mandated money that should be spent for hospital construction. By the time you tally up all of those mandated spendings and you add them to the federal mandated spending, 85% of the California budget is locked in. That gives them 15% of flexibility on years like this when we've got a $19 billion shortfall. Now in Proposition 13, you see something that's one of the problems that we have with the initiative process. There was a problem. It was a serious problem. Property taxes were going up year after year. Inflation was high. People had less buying power. The property tax were set by tax assessors in every county. Some of them were corrupt and taking kickbacks for low evaluations, while other ones were getting high evaluations. So there was a problem. But the solution that was proposed had all sorts of unforeseen circumstances that came as a result of it. First of all, state revenues in the first year after Proposition 13 passed were decreased by 57%. They had a big surplus at that point because of these rising property taxes. And so the idea was this is just, extra money there, so it's not a problem. But year on year of depleting that particular source of money resulted in a shift of power from local government to state government. Because local government used to be able to allocate money for fire and schools and police from that money that came from property taxes. After Proposition 13, they rely on the state to provide that money to them. In addition, Proposition 13 had a requirement that any increase in local taxes required a 2/3 vote, not by the elected people, but a 2/3 vote by the population in that local government.
You better go back to beautiful Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Georgia, Tennessee.
The problem with term limits is you end up with an amateur legislature.
The 800-page budget document was published online today, and today is the day that the legislators are voting on it.
The problem is that every single year, the budget process where the governor delivers a budget, the legislature is supposed to look at it, amend it, and then vote on it by July 1st, doesn't happen. And as a result, you're in this crisis situation in the month of October, and it's that point that they say, okay, we can't afford to debate this anymore, we've got to have something to vote on. Now, back in the days when Willie Brown was the self-proclaimed Ayatollah of the Assembly, you didn't have to worry about whether or not he would get the votes to pass the budget, because he had a take-no-prisoners approach to that. Now, whatever you think about Willie Brown, and I know that he's probably most responsible for people voting for term limits, having that kind of strong leadership in the Assembly allowed a negotiated settlement to be debated, looked at, and passed. The situation now with relative newcomers in the leadership is that they don't have any control over their party caucus. And as a result, you can have this long process. And I mean, at this point, they hardly even bother to debate the budget because they know it's not going to pass. They know that at some point the big five are going to have to go in and smoke cigars with Arnold Schwarzenegger and come up with it. Hopefully it's not Karen Bass smoking cigars. But at any rate, they're going to decide this behind closed doors and then present it at the last minute to vote on. So it's not like that's the way it's supposed to be done. It's just that that's what's happening year after year.
I know a number of folks who work as lobbyists in Sacramento for organizations, mostly for unions and other similar organizations. Universally, they will tell you that the single greatest effect of term limits has been to increase the power of lobbyists. That's what it's done. More than any other thing, term limits has increased the power of lobbyists because they are the most experienced, the most knowledgeable people in the room when they get to sit down and go over something. It used to be when legislators had long careers that legislators would become expert on certain areas of policy. You would know, everybody in the legislature knew that this guy was the one who really knew policy on road building or really knew water policy or whatever. And that knowledge gave them a degree of power and influence that transcended party and ideology. Now, whenever they get together in a room to figure out the details of something, you know for sure that the most knowledgeable person in the room will be a lobbyist. And that has enormously increased the power of lobbyists in Sacramento. That's what term limits sounded to many people like a fine idea, but that its effects have not been positive for the process.
Our Constitution was passed in 1879, and the story is that they got together, they wrote this Constitution, they took it back to the legislature, they started to go through it, reading it, so people would know what was in it. People got bored and said, let's go to lunch, and they passed the Constitution. And then they went and they broke for drinks, I think. So, you know, we've sort of amended this Constitution to death over the past 100 years plus, and the time has really come to sort of look at some of these structural questions.
There's a lot we don't know about what's in that state budget, but I think one thing that we can guarantee is that there are no lasting solutions to anything in that budget. I think we can also guarantee that actions are being taken down there that will make things harder next year, that will worsen the problem for next year, just as some of the actions that were taken last year and the year before that and the year before that made things harder for this year. And so I think we can count on it that that's happening again. So nothing is going on down there in Sacramento that's going to solve any long-term problems.
California is a garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re